This is the tallest metro station in the world. With 88 feet above street level, it does get a little bit windy up here. Located in Gowanus to the north of Brooklyn, this is Smith Ninth Street.
You probably recognize the city behind me, New York City, which is home to many businesses, people, and industries. But what is the secret to New York City's success? And what were the natural forces that produced the place where the city is located today? In this video, we will visit the places whose natural history influenced recent history. We will see the effect of natural forces such as rivers, ocean waves, and glaciers, the landscapes they formed, and the events that occurred there, which shaped the city into what it is today. If you look at the skyline of Manhattan, you will see that skyscrapers exist primarily in two clusters, downtown and midtown. But why is there a gap between the skyscrapers? Well, legend says that the layers of rock beneath it, called the bedrock, are not secure. In fact, buildings in lower Manhattan, such as a prison called the Tombs, and an area called Collect Pond, used to keep sinking into the ground.
The rocks that exist on the island of Manhattan today were exposed to heat and pressure over a long period of time. And this caused the rocks to change in a process known as regional metamorphism. Today in Central Park, we can see a giant outcropping of this rock known as Umpire Rock, and it's made out of a material called Manhattan schist. By taking a closer look at the rock itself, we can see the banding of the minerals, which are the component ingredients of this rock. This is the bedrock underneath the entire city of New York. But what about the landscapes that we see today? And how did Manhattan become the city? Well, the word Manhattan comes from the Native American word, Mannahatta, which means something like the island of many hills. But to understand the story of where the city begins, we need to go back to the first European settlements on these shores.
The main processes that guide our discussion of landforms is a cycle known as erosion and deposition. Rocks, like Umpire Rock, are exposed to the elements, and over time, the weather breaks the rock down. Nearby natural processes, like gravity and water, will transport the rock, breaking it more in the first part of the process called erosion. As nature stops moving the rock, called sediment, it is placed in a way that is unique in its addition to the landscape, in a part of the process known as deposition.
These processes will leave their mark on any landscape in a way that is both recognizable and can be read just like a story. The best example of New York City physically changing over the years is right here in downtown Manhattan in today's financial district. If you were standing here on Water Street 400 years ago, you would be standing directly on the water, hence the name. But today, the water is actually 3 whole blocks down.
The story of New York begins in 1609, when a British man named Henry Hudson was rejected from British sailing companies to explore the New World and began working for the Dutch. The Dutch were a recently liberated people from Spanish oppression, and they adopted a policy of tolerance and trade, which yielded them a robust economy and allowed them to become one of the dominant empires in the age of exploration. The street grid of the financial district is one of the few relics of the earliest settlers of New York City, which was then called New Amsterdam. Other relics of the Dutch period include the names scattered throughout the area, from Long Island to Staten Island and Brooklyn. The Dutch colony eventually became a British one, and today it is an American city. But we can clearly see how downtown Manhattan has grown from the original Dutch size. By looking at a map of New York City, we can see that some of the names tell us about the significance of the place. For example, Brooklyn and the Bronx tell us about New York's Dutch history, while Queens County tells us about the British. But then there's some names that tell us about its natural history. Places around the water like Coney Island or Brighton Beach, as well as certain neighborhoods referring to their position and elevation, from up in Brooklyn Heights down to Park Slope, back up to Prospect Heights, Crown Heights, and all the way to Forest Hills. These names and places hold the history of the natural forces which shaped this city.
Our first agent of erosion on the list is glaciers. And to get a taste for the scale of the impact that glaciers have had, we're going to take a ferry to Staten Island.
After a few decades of Dutch rule, the colony was taken over by the British and renamed New York. Under the British rule, the population of New York City began to rise, and tensions between loyalists to the empire and rebels began to rise, culminating in the Declaration of Independence. However, the breakaway colonists were put to the test, since they would fight a 7-year war to actually earn this independence.
The landscape of Long Island and Staten Island was formed by glaciers, and we can clearly see these effects here in Princess Bay in Staten Island. The Princess Bay Lighthouse was built in 1864, overlooking the Raritan Bay to help guide ships into New York's harbor. Its location is strategic since it's built on the highest natural point in Staten Island, on top of a glacial cliff. During the last ice age, a glacier known as the Wisconsin Ice Sheet covered most of what is today New York. As it moved across, it eroded or transported hundreds of tons of sediment across New York State. This erosion had two main effects. First, as the glacier moved across New York City, the rocks at the bottom would scrape against the bedrock, smoothing it down just like sandpaper. The second effect was those same rocks would leave these parallel scratches and grooves in the bedrock, known as striations. At Umpire Rock, where we began our journey, you can see some of those striations on the exposed schist.
As the glacier melted, it began to deposit the rocks, leaving a formation called a terminal moraine. A hill made out of till, aka rocks that were dropped by the glacier. You can also notice the unsorted till laying along the beach. So this moraine is where the lighthouse is located, standing 85 feet above the bay.
At the top of this glacial cliff, we can see how the sediment over time has mixed with decayed organic matter, creating a layer of soil out of which plants can grow.
Down the beach, at the southernmost point of New York City itself, stands a building called the Conference House. This is where a diplomatic meeting was held early into the Revolutionary War in order to prevent the rest of the bloody conflict that was about to come. However, the attempt was unsuccessful and the Americans would have to follow through and fight for their freedom. The house itself is made of sediment that is found in this general area that was deposited by the glacier. Not only have the glaciers completely sanded down the area and added its own features to the landscape, it also shaped the revolution itself.
We have seen that glaciers have had a tremendous impact on the landscape by eroding away hundreds of tons of sediment. The landscape that we see today and the American Revolution were both shaped by glaciers. No other place captures this better than right here, Battle Hill. This is a site of a Revolutionary War battle, which ended with the Americans having their last stronghold here on this hill. The geology of Brooklyn really came to the advantage of the Americans because Battle Hill, which is located in Greenwood Cemetery today, is the highest natural point in Brooklyn, as high as 216 feet above sea level. The Americans eventually had to flee New York City, which then became a British city during the war. But the men who gave their lives here on Battle Hill gave the others a chance to fight another day. The glaciers set the stage for the American Revolution, but the natural force which would propel the young nation forward would be another agent of erosion, and that is running water.
When Hudson sailed into New York Harbor in 1609, he realized that the river was coming from a source of fresh water upstate and flowing southward, mixing with the ocean water in the harbor. Hudson mistakenly thought that this river was the pathway leading across the continent. This was because he underestimated the size of North America and assumed the river was large enough to cross it. But this would not be accomplished until 200 years later. But from the age of exploration to the industrial age, from the Revolutionary War to the Cold War, New York Harbor remains a vital waterway.
In order for New York to go from being an influential colony to a prosperous city, New Yorkers needed to figure out a way to connect the Hudson River to the other rivers in the United States. This would be accomplished by a man who is also buried here in Greenwood Cemetery, Dewitt Clinton. He was the governor of New York from 1825 to 1828, and his vision of what New York would become allowed him to harness the power that rivers have.
His vision was for New York City to industrialize and become a modern city with a history and a way to make a profit.
DeWitt Clinton started a campaign to connect the Hudson River to Lake Erie in a canal known as the Erie Canal, which opened in 1825 and was the first time that New York was now connected by water to the other parts of this country. The Erie Canal allowed New York Harbor to become the golden door into the continent of North America, and this boosted New York's maritime trade, making it a very prosperous city. But this also allowed for immigration on a scale that was never seen up until that point, and was another major factor which shaped this city.
I have always wondered, is Coney Island an actual island? By looking at old maps, I saw that it was actually one separate from the mainland. As Coney Island was becoming a popular destination in the late 1800s, many shows and rides were set up along the seashore. During this time, train lines and stations were built to get there from the rest of Brooklyn in order to easily bring tourists from the city. For locals to have a place to stay, the island was connected to the mainland of Brooklyn by draining part of the Coney Island Creek and filling it up with sediment in a process of human deposition. The boardwalk was then built over this, which provided easy access to the rides and the shows.
Today, we can see what remains of the Coney Island Creek, which runs through the backyard of Coney Island. And the Coney Island Creek opens up into the Gravesend Bay, which then opens up into the New York Harbor.
But what formed the island in the first place? Well, this takes us to our third agent of erosion, ocean waves. Ocean waves cycle sediment to and from the shore, which changes it more consistently. We can see deposition along its shoreline as a result of wave action. Wave action is the combined effort of both the waves and the wind on the land. The prevailing wind will set the general direction that the waves will build their features along the shore. Coney Island is a barrier island, which means that it's land running parallel to the coast, but it was created as a result of ocean waves.
Long Island, which has 2 out of the 5 boroughs of New York City, has a lot of barrier islands along its southern shore. On the west by Brooklyn, there's Coney Island. Next by Queens, there's the Rockaways. And farther still, there's Jones Beach and Fire Island. Besides beaches, another feature made by waves is a marsh. And to see this, we're going down the shoreline to the Garretson Inlet.
This side of the Garretson Inlet is known as Plumb Beach, and it was always less famous than Manhattan or Brighton beaches. As a result, it was less developed and mostly became a place for squatters. By the turn of the 20th century, the government bought a lot of this land in order to build the highway, which is today the Belt Parkway. In order to build the bridge, it was decided that Plumb Beach would just be extended, closing up the Garretson Inlet instead of making the bridge longer. And here we have another example of human deposition on the Brooklyn shoreline. Here at the Garretson Inlet, we're standing at the opening into the marsh. This is another feature which was made by waves. And every day, twice a day, the tide brings ocean water in and takes it out.
New York City's sky and shoreline are iconic because they symbolize not just the success of the city, but also the giant natural forces which shaped it.
We have seen how natural forces have shaped the landscape of New York and allowed it to become into the city which you and I know today. We have seen how agents of erosion, like running water, glaciers, and waves, have shaped and guided the city from its wide array of events in its history. But during hard times, New Yorkers have learnt the lesson that the natural forces have taught us, and that is, when things break and move away, it's just building up elsewhere, which will shape our future for the better.